Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. On behalf of the Gender and Feminism section and the Feminist Conceptual Lab and the Feminist Conceptual Incubator, all projects that we have here in Van Leer, I'm honored and happy to introduce Eva קיטאי. Before I will tell you a bit about her accomplishments, I would like to ask Professor Lebיא, the head of the Institute, to greet.
Thank you, Miry, and it's a real honor and pleasure to have Professor קיטאי with us today. I want to thank in advance Rozmrine and Bye for making this event happen. And also thank you all for being here this afternoon. I should probably not admit my ignorance of your work, but the little that I do know comes from the short article that you sent us, and it's in light of this article that I did read with quite great interest, that I want to say very briefly, or to place very briefly what I understand your project is, and its relationship, and more importantly, its relationship to the kind of questions that are right now on our table here at the Institute. And I think that the question of liberalism, or at least a specific way of thinking about liberalism, a limited way of understanding liberalism through the idea of the self-possessive, self-controlling, controlled individual has been criticized for quite a while now from a variety of perspectives, including from a feminist perspective. But I think we return to this question with a certain urgency these days, at least at this institute, also because we see and we've learned to acknowledge the limitations, certain limitations of liberal political theory and more generally of liberalism. So we take the opportunity, now that liberalism is under attack everywhere, democratic liberalism in many, many countries, perhaps including in this country. We should use this not as an occasion to simply return and repeat what we already knew and believed about liberalism, but also take this as an opportunity to raise some questions about liberalism and why perhaps it has become less popular than we would like it to be. And perhaps some of the fears lie within a certain understanding of liberalism itself. And so it's in this context that I think we need a new language to talk about political theory and justice. And I think that your work, as I understand it, attempts to provide us this new language, to move from contract to covenant, to think about ways in which we can reimagine what freedom means, not necessarily the liberal understanding of freedom, to think about what binds us together and brings us together from the beginning, and not only as individuals entering a social contract. So this is one, I think, angle which is very relevant for the work done here at the Institute at the moment from a variety of perspectives. And second, I think, and this is also part of our agenda, is to show and demonstrate how important feminist theory is beyond perhaps the limits of discussing only questions of gender equality, but which is important in itself, but to try and think about, through the perspective of feminism, about broader questions of social justice and political theory, which also means not thinking only about women and not only about gender, but talking about other groups in society and bringing them together in the way that you brought disability studies together to think with feminist studies, I think is one very productive direction. So this is only to say that I very much look forward to hearing
thank you
your
very
talk,
much
and that I think it's very relevant to the kind of questions that are at the moment on our table. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Shan.
you. Oh.
And I want now to properly introduce Professor Kitai and also have a few points to a way of I as also a philosopher think about this project and perhaps to formulate what we'll hear in a certain context. So first, partially list of her achievements. Professor Kitai is a retired distinguished professor of philosophy at Stony Brook University, SUNY, a senior fellow of the Stony Brook Center of Medical Humanities, Compassionate Care and Bioethics, and an affiliate of the Women Studies Program. She is the recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and NEH Fellowship and the APA and PHI Beta Kappa Leibovitch Prize. She has also been recognized for her work in feminist philosophy, being named the Women Philosopher of the Year 1903 and 2003. Sorry, that was not that old. Sorry, 2003 and 2004. By the Society for Women in Philosophy, and having chaired a committee on the status of women on 1997-2001. Her book, Love's Labor, Essays on Women, Equality and Dependency, has received international attention. Her other work includes the book Cognitive Disability at the Challenge and Moral Philosophy, published in 2010, Blackwell Guide to Feminist Philosophy, published 2007, Theoretical Perspective on Dependency and Women, published in 2003, Metaphor, Its Cognitive Force and Linguistic Structures, 1987, and edited collections, Frames, Fields and Contrasts, published on 1992. And one more, Women and Moral Theory, published in 1985. She has edited many journal issues in feminist philosophy and philosophy of disability and has published over 85 articles and book chapters. Her latest book that was just published by Oxford University Press called
It's right here.
Learning from My Daughter, The Value and the Care of Disabled Minds. It's an amazing book. There are some flyers outside. If you want to purchase the book in a very good price with a significant discount, you can find the flyer outside. Okay, so just few points. In her pioneering book, Love's Labor, Essays on Women, Equality and Dependency, Kitai states what we all know as human beings, but has become more and more a marginalized aspect of human life. Dependency, Kitai reminds moral philosophers and other person also, is inescapable in the life of each individual. We are all dependent on others, and dependency calls for dependency work, praxis of tending to others in their state of vulnerability. Kitai illuminates another fact about dependency and care. Those who engage in the work of caring for dependents are themselves dependent on others for support and assistance. The implications of these postulates are dramatic. Kitai calls us to rethink the most basic concept of social and political arrangements, equality, justice, and responsibility. She argues against a Rawlsian conception of justice, which locates caring for dependents within the private sphere and overlooks its social and political aspects. She argues that ensuring adequate support for caretakers and dependents is a matter of social justice. A decent society acknowledges the inevitability of vulnerability and protects people from conditions in which vulnerability becomes injurious or demeaning. From perspective focused on care, society which holds a view of its members as independent, self-determined individuals fails to recognize and support its members, as well as provide them with substantial equality and dignity. קיטאי introduces care and vulnerability as two related critical categories which both function in two ways. First, the theorization of care reveals the effects of liberal individualistic vision of society on those who are dependent more than others and on dependency workers. As such, קיטאי shows how care and vulnerability are distributed along lines of gender, race, class, as well as bodily and cognitive modalities. Second, קיטאי theorized care as a basis for a normative alternative to the liberal image of individuals-based society. She writes, by centering a theory of justice on the inevitability of human dependency and the inextricable nature of our interdependence, we can then look at the fact of human dependency anew. We see it not as an impediment to living well, but as a source of value, a source of connection, an occasion for developing our capacity for thought, empathy, sensitivity, trust, ingenuity, and creativity. In short, as providing for us the conditions of our distinctive human freedom and dignity, end quote. קיטא이's theory of care, along with other important feminist thinkers such as Carol Gilligan, Virginia Held, Sarah Raddick, and John Tronto, promotes wider social understanding of the importance and complexity of the labor of care. It also offers a powerful conceptualization of life with disability as full life. While the main group of the disability movement have insisted that justice for disabled people means allowing them to live independently, קיטאי offers us a way to rethink the ideal of full life and well-being. Thus, I would like to suggest is one of the most exciting challenges that קיטאי poses for neoliberal ableism. Her work demonstrates that the political potential of vulnerability and care lies in widening our notion of meaningful and full life. Care and vulnerability can serve us as a point of departure for rethinking concepts such as full life, agency, and well-being. Rather than holding to an ideal of full life as secure, independent, self-determined life, the theoretical challenge that קיטאי introduced to us is to understand how people are acting with their dependency and vulnerability in ways that challenge norms, create knowledge, relations, sensibilities, and skills. Finally, קיטאי in her writings creates new philosophical subject. Her work demonstrates that it is possible and indeed essential to think and philosophize as corporal, emotional, caring people. So today she will speak to us about refocusing justice on care. Please welcome Professor קיטאי.
Thank you for those wonderful introductions, and I hope you haven't said everything I have to say today. But maybe it doesn't hurt to hear some things twice. But this work is work that it follows on the work I did in Love's Labor. It will be the basis of the book that follows this book, Learning from My Daughter. All three works really can be called Learning from My Daughter because my work is very much situated in my experience with a person who is very, very significantly disabled and teaching me anew what values to treasure. This, and I have to say, I think you'll see it in the talk. I'm not a critic of some of the fundamental values of liberalism. I'm more a critic of the way in which those values are interpreted. Because too much criticism is coming from liberalism from the wrong areas, and I don't want to be seen as doing that. So, in this essay, Taking People as They Are, wonderful essay for a political philosopher, the political philosopher Joshua Cohen puts forward a notion of a democratic social ethos. And I want to start with this democratic social ethos and plumb its intuition to cast a fresh eye on dominant liberal conceptions of justice in light of specifically feminist political subjectivity, which takes care as not only a central moral value, but also as a central political value. So this social ethos is given here on your slide, that the way we live together, the social arrangements in a democratic society of free and equal people, should leave no one less well off than anyone needs to be, and that each is treated with the respect that is as someone whose life matters as much as anyone else's. Now, Cohen tells us that this is the intuitive idea behind John Rawls's principles of justice, in particular the second principle that I don't know how much political philosophy people have here, so I'll skip that. And that such a theory, Rawls, the preeminent American political philosopher of the 20th century, tells us, is to provide the fair terms of social cooperation. Now, this sounds like a very good starting point for justice, but I want to cast doubt not on the fair terms part, but on the social cooperation part. Social cooperation is too narrow a notion to capture all that is involved in the way we live together, the social arrangements of free and equal people. My claim is that to interpret the social ethos in a way that aligns the notion of fair terms of social cooperation with the intuitions that Cohen articulates is an ethos shaped by a masculine political subjectivity, because it fails to take into account the fate of dependence and the care of dependence, which has not been the work of those who have written political philosophy. It's a sphere that's been kept out of the public sphere and has harnessed the labor, mostly of women. Instead, I propose a theory of justice more faithful to the intuitive idea Cohen presents, is derived from a social ethos articulated through a feminist ethics of care that would aim for principles of justice that provide us with fair terms for living together, given our inevitable dependency and our inextricable interdependency. Such principles should ensure that no one is less well off than anyone needs to be because of one's condition of inevitable human dependency, or because one cares for dependence. And such principles would treat not only those who presumably are independent, rational agents as those whose life matters as much as any other independent, rational agent, but would treat everyone as someone whose life matters as much as anyone's. To begin, let's consider the dominant political subjectivity of the modern period and the picture of society that has held political philosophy in its thrall since at least the 17th century. It begins with the view of the person that the Hobbesian philosopher David Gautier sets down with great perspicuity. Here it is. A person is conceived as an independent center of activity, endeavoring to direct his capacities and resources to the fulfillment of his interests. I'm going to, all right. He considers what he can do, but initially draws no distinction between what he may and may not do. From the perspective of our unfettered subjectivity, we may appear to ourselves to be an independent center of activity, especially, but perhaps not exclusively, if we are men whose subjectivity has been shaped by Western modern sensibilities. But it is especially evident to women who are responsible for caring for dependent others, fulfilling our interests almost invariably involves other people and institutions, and even those very interests are shaped and drawn from others. The problem for political philosophy, as it's been mostly thought of and articulated by the pantheon of great men, can be gleaned from another claim that Gautier makes. The contractarian sees sociability as enriching human life. For him, it becomes a source of exploitation if it induces persons to acquiesce to institutions and practices that, but for their fellow feelings, would be costly to them. The latter portion of this sentence is doubtless true. Some persons can and do exploit the sociability of some and take on labor and responsibilities that ought to be more fairly shared. But Gautier and other political philosophers go astray when they presume that sociality is only an enhancement to a form of life that could possibly go on without it. In fact, the exploitation which Gautier speaks of arises precisely because human life cannot go on without sociability and the work and the responsibility it imposes. The view that sociability is a mere enhancement, not a necessity, has led philosophers to go to great lengths to explain why independent and free beings who have their own view of their own good should give up so much freedom and independence to unite with others in mutually constraining arrangements. It's been the puzzle of social contract theory. Why do these people bother to get together? They're all doing fine by themselves, right? There have been many explanations. Some of these is the idea that we just have innate sociality, and so we decide to give up all that independence to join in with others. Others point out to our vulnerability to harm others can visit upon them. Still others to the idea that we can do better materially when we're united, or to the belief that human life can realize its particular dignity only when lived in concert with others. In short, that we form societies because doing so is mutually advantageous, and doing so justly is at once rational and reasonable. All these explanations have some merit, but they seem to skirt what is most obvious, that we are born dependent and stay dependent for long periods of time, that the care and protection of dependent beings is a shared enterprise, most successfully carried out when responsibility is shared between individuals and the community at large. Humans as a species have little choice about the need for collective action, insofar as they have evolved in such a way that their very survival depends not on them alone. That is, the idea that we begin by thinking persons as independent centers of activity involves more than the normal distortion of an idealization. There's an incoherence at its heart. It may be logically possible for there to be such beings, but such beings cannot be human persons who have inherited the social capabilities and needs that make human life possible and that make human life in all its variety what it is. It doesn't take people as they are, in other words. That is, because for human societies to be possible, for human existence to be possible, we must be cared for in relations of dependency and interdependency. We only grow into human persons we become through being cared for and supported in relations of dependency. We only maintain ourselves through illness, disease, disability, and the frailty of old age in relations of dependency. Human inevitable dependency begins then with the following individual facts. Humans have the longest period of infant and childhood dependency of any other creature. Humans live past their reproductive and productive prime and often experience more or less dependency in their late years. Humans, like all fellow creatures, experience periods of illness during which they would perish if they were not assisted and maintained through periods of incapacity. Humans are vulnerable to being born or becoming disabled. Such implacable facts of the human condition we can call, for short, inevitable human dependency. Inevitable human dependency may take many forms and can sometimes be conflated with socially constructed dependencies. Inevitable human dependencies take different shapes in distinct historical periods, cultures, and societies, and sometimes a form of dependence that seems inevitable in some circumstances can be seen constructed in another. But for the most part, it's important to understand that some dependencies are not constructs and are inevitable in the sense that they are rooted in our biology and not constructed by social arrangements. Inevitable human dependency differs from socially induced dependency, such as when a person or a group rob others of the power they need for survival and flourishing. Slaves are forced to be dependent on masters for their most basic needs by laws and cruel treatment. Women in the past, and maybe in the present, are forced to be dependent on men for the well-being of themselves and their dependents when they're denied the means by which to take care of their own and their children's needs. Mobility-impaired people who can propel themselves in a wheelchair are made dependent when the spaces they need to access are inaccessible in a wheelchair. These and similar forms of dependency are removed by giving people rights or opportunities or entitlements. There are also dependencies that are derived. That is, they are dependencies. I've never done that before. They are dependencies that one person has because of the relationship they bear to someone else who is inevitably dependent. Persons who are responsible for the care and well-being of an inevitably dependent person that person may herself become more or less dependent according to the extent of the other's dependence on her. When you're caring for an infant who can do nothing for themselves, you need other people to provide the things that you need for yourself and for the infant. And that's what I call derivative dependency. And the person supplying the person doing the care work and the dependent, I call in some of my work the provisioners. While at any given time, a certain portion of the population will be inevitably dependent, every one of us is either inevitably dependent in the sense of inevitable dependency that I've talked about, vulnerable to inevitable dependency, derivatively dependent, or vulnerable to becoming derivatively dependent. In this sense, dependency is a feature of all our lives, but to different degrees and in different ways, whether or not we are dependent at any given time. While some may be able to opt out of caring for a dependent, inevitable dependency and derived dependence are normally conditions we find ourselves in, not conditions we choose or seek. This is another way it differs from liberal views of societies where relationships that we take on are voluntary relations. Our independence is at best relative, but it is really a fiction, a construct that has more or less value to various actors in different situations. When battling imposed dependencies, the cry for independence can be valuable. A woman who asks for the right to enter the workplace so she can be economically independent is asking for a right to be recognized as a particular sort of efficacious, self-determining agent. A disabled person who demands workplace accommodation so she can be independent is similarly asserting the right to such recognition. But workers are dependent on their bosses, entrepreneurs are dependent on their investors and customers. Entering the workforce, being able to earn a living, is not independence as such, but independence from certain oppressive conditions and a dependence on other conditions that are hopefully less oppressive. As we are dependent on a boss is dependent on our labor. As we are dependent on customers who are pleased by what we offer are dependent on what we offer. In addition, we are inextricably interdependent. The notion of social cooperation captures elements of this interdependence, but retains some of the fiction that as self-determining and self-sufficient agents, we can take or leave this cooperative arrangement if we do not agree to the terms. To insist on our inextricable interdependence is to say that whatever social arrangements we enter on a voluntaristic basis, what is not a matter for voluntarism is the fact that we must be engaged in some social arrangements, some form of dependence and interdependence. Yet in the picture that begins with Gautier's characterization of subjectivity and of persons, the political significance of the demands and consequences of our inevitable human dependence and its inextricable, that is to say, unavoidable interdependence are excluded by fiat. In inevitable dependencies, we are not, by definition, independent, equally situated, or even roughly equally empowered, to use Rawls's formulation. Nor are we independent centers of activity. It is also not possible for all to engage in cooperative ventures around production on the same terms, for we all have different relations to dependency concerns. Rather than start with an origin tale of the independent, autonomous, self-sufficient beings who contract to come together, or who somehow reason that they are better off in concert than alone, I want to appeal to a different origin tale. This one recognizes that from the start, two aspects of our condition from the start. Humans start life with long periods of dependency and are prone to disability, illness, and frailty. Carers become dependent on others to provide provisions for ourselves and our dependents. While the social contract envisioning that's the Leviathan, by the way. Can't quite see it, but the Leviathan there is composed of little tiny people. While the social contract envisioning some primordial state of nature that we forgo to become socialized citizens of the state, our alternativism vision is tethered on feminist interpretations of anthropological data, evolutionary biology, and even sociobiology. Sarah Hardy has argued that our long dependency at the start of life and our accommodation to certain environmental pressures made us the only great ape who shared caregiving. Given our need for cooperative caregiving, those infants whose kin survived past periods of production and reproduction, especially grandmothers, but also grandfathers, were themselves more likely to survive because these older folks could serve as trusted caregivers, additional providers, and stabilizing factors in maintaining communities essential to nurture and protect the young. Along with shared caregiving came a number of important developments that allowed hominoids to develop into beings who could enter into trusting social relationships, societal relationships with others, even non-kin. Among these are the need for infants to form relations of care with these other caregivers. That is, the infants, she says, have to be able to seduce not only the mother, but also potential other caregivers as well. And she points out how when you see a baby in a mother's arm, that baby always looks at the other person. Right? And she said that's part of this seduction that the infant is engaged in with the other to build up this kind of relationship with the other person. The need to have additional caregivers who could be trusted with infants, not their own, and the need for mothers who feel secure that these others could be trusted with their dependent children. The very demanding nature of that care has meant that not only do human mothers, fathers individually care for their young, but they can do so only through arrangements of shared caregiving. Such arrangements were made possible by and helped further develop capacities of trust, empathy, cooperation, and sociability so extensive that we permit others, even non-kin, to watch over our vulnerable infants. These are capacities and needs for sociality that we call upon when we ask ourselves and others to act with justice toward others. All human life, and most especially life in complex societies for which we seek adequate conceptions of justice, are highly and inextricably interdependent, and all this interdependence begins with the fact of our inevitable dependency. If this picture has any merit, then it is less our rationality than our empathetic and relational capacities that are foundational to social organization. An ethic that puts these empathetic capacities and relational self-understandings at its center is an ethic of care. Our sense of duty and obligation to dependence comes less from a rationalistic weighing of utilities, an abstract sense of duty, or a calculated tit-for-tat reciprocity, than from an understanding of responsibilities that come with social roles, from a sense of responsibility we have to relationships formed over years, and from our empathetic understanding of the potential for suffering and privatation that can come with helplessness of infancy, with disability, disease, or frail old age. In this state of nature, this second state of nature, this real state of nature, we were always social beings and in social arrangements. The question of justice is how to ensure that relationships of dependency not become exploitative and abusive, to create institutions that can allocate resources and distribute labor so that all can benefit in an equitable manner, that power and entitlements be distributed so that no one's life is blighted by what we can call the burdens of dependency, and how to transmit values that will assure that each one's life is as valued as anyone else's, and that no one is less well off than they need to be because of their relationship to dependency. it would draw on a public ethic of care, which in turn draws from the social ethos that is now largely privatized. It centers on life lived in the consciousness that care is a central value. Elsewhere, I've introduced the term dulia, and I introduced that term, borrowing it from the postpartum caregiver, the doula, who cares for the mother so that the mother can care for her infant. And to speak of that principle taken into the public sphere as a public ethic of care. Dulia is the principle that society as a whole needs to support the provisioning that enables the caregiver to care for dependents, and to do so in a way that does not neglect the interests and well-being of the caregiver, and that promotes the value of care as an ethical ideal. The obligation that finds expression in dulia is a form of reciprocity. Each of us who aspired to adulthood has been the beneficiary of care provided not only by a mothering person, but by those who share in all the efforts to make that care possible. We owe a debt that is paid back, but it is paid to subsequent generations. We use a conception of reciprocity, but not the standard one of economic exchange found in most political philosophy, to express the debt we incur as recipients of this benefit. While non-standard, it is nevertheless a notion we deploy in certain circumstances. As a parent, I want my child to repay me for my caregiving labor, less by caring for me than by caring well for the child he may have. I've spoken of this enlarged conception of reciprocity as what's captured in the phrase, "What goes round comes round." I have that here. Okay. I'm not quite ready for that one. Since its inception, an ethic of care has been formulated as a contrast to an ethic of justice. Yet what we're encountering here are concepts of fairness and reciprocity, notions that are associated with moral orientation toward justice, but that here are grounded in our need for care, in our condition of inevitable dependency, and in our relationship to care for one another, rather than principally in notions of rights and social cooperation understood in traditional liberal theories of justice. So what I want to suggest is that we should not be thinking of care and justice as two competing ethics. Instead, I suggest that we view justice, as political philosophers such as Rawls have viewed it, as the first virtue of political philosophy, and the virtue that applies to the basic institutions of society. Every political philosophy is at the same time associated with a moral theory, and ethics that should be normative for individuals living in that society. We create a just society when we create one in which people are enabled to live ethical lives within it by the just institutions that govern their lives. So, for example, the International Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on philosophy on Aristotle says, of Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle describes the happy life intended for a man by nature as one lived in accordance with virtue. And in his Politics, he describes the role that politics and the political community must play in bringing about the virtuous life in the citizenry. Similarly, Rawls's two principles of justice gives us a political philosophy in which Kantian ethics, which makes self-respect central to morality, in which in a just society may be realizable. Rawls's conception of justice is in turn motivated by the Kantian ideal. If instead of opposing care to justice, we ask, what sort of principles would we want to govern our basic institutions so that we could realize the ethical ideals put forward in an ethics of care? When I speak here of ethical ideals, I'm thinking about an ethics of care not as a descriptive practice telling us how we currently engage in practices of care, but in the normative ideal embedded in these practices. A carer who's moving through the motions of taking care of someone is not embodying the ethical ideal of care. We speak of this person as doing poor care. But when we think about care as an ethical ideal, we might rather say that she is doing some sort of custodial work, but it isn't care. So, how might we think of a conception of care if we think that just basic institutions should support an ethics of care as the ethic guiding members of a just society? Note that what I'm proposing here is to envision a political theory, that is a theory of justice, that is shaped by a feminist subjectivity as that subjectivity is captured in an ethics of care, and an understanding that dependence and interdependence, rather than independence, is central to who we are as ethical agents. Let me just say a word about why I take this to be a feminist subjectivity. It's a curious fact that when you go back in the history, you find out that women have talked about equality for just about as long as you can imagine. But what they've talked about is equality of education, political rights, the right to work. What they have not talked about until very recently, until about the 1960s, is men sharing care work. Now, that may seem very strange, but the fact is that the notion of care has just been naturalized, just as something women do. And it hasn't been until recent feminist theory that that notion has been questioned. So to talk about dependency and dependency concerns as being specifically feminist is to draw on that fact that women throughout have spent the time taking care of children, the sick, the disabled, the elderly, and men are just beginning to start to enter that field hesitatingly, slowly, some willingly, some not so willingly, but they're starting. When based on these considerations of care, the question of justice is transformed. We ask, given our interdependence and our mutual dependence, what principles provide the fair terms that should govern the basic social institutions in which we live together, work together, and care about each other? What institutions do we require to support each other and enable each other to flourish, given our different capacities and our different relationships to dependency and care? What are the governing principles for establishing and maintaining such institutions? At best, Rawlsian principles that govern fair terms of social cooperation are a subset of such fair terms when they are sufficiently broadened to include everyone, not only the normal and the fully cooperative. Such a theory of justice does not merely fairly distribute care, such as one commodity, the kind of theory I'm proposing, but forms a social order in which participants act toward one another in accordance with an ethic of care. Many liberal values of equality and freedom, can and would be preserved, but in a somewhat modified form. And what I put forward here is far from a comprehensive theory. It's just meant to give a sense of what such a theory might look like, and hopefully inspire others to work on the project. So the first concept I will talk about are the circumstance of justice. Again, following Rawls, where he begins to develop his theory, talking about the circumstances of justice. And he talks about objective circumstances of justice and subjective circumstances of justice. And here already we begin to see a difference. Here. Rawls begins talking about the theory of justice, borrowing from Hume, and he talks about the objective circumstance of justice as being the circumstance that we need in order for justice to function at all. So in times of great scarcity, there's no point talking about justice. In times of affluence, he says, we don't need justice. While it may be difficult to conceive of a just society in conditions of severe scarcity, justice in the sense that we're seeking is not confined to circumstances of relative scarcity. Even under conditions of no scarcity, human beings are still in need of care. An infant living in the midst of plenty still needs someone who's going to procure those goods for him if he's going to survive. A person with significant impairments may still be disadvantaged even in the midst of plenty if she cannot access those goods she requires for her well-being. So already the objective circumstances look different. The subjective circumstances. For all, the subjective circumstances are the psychological facts about humans, and particularly that each one seeks to realize his own conception of the good. This subjective stance is circumscribed by the notion of the self we began discussing, the self as an independent center of activity. But in a conception of justice that's focused on care, the primary constituents of society are not simply individuals with their own interests, but individuals who exist in varying relations of inevitable dependency and inextricable interdependency. At the same time, it recognizes individuals as connected. It must also preserve the integrity of each individual. Such a theory is neither communitarian nor individualistic, but balances commitments to the individual and to the relationships. Let's see. I did something very fancy where I'm supposed to go back and forth. It's not working. Second one that I'm going to talk about is equality. Every theory of justice recognizes that each one's life matters as much as anyone's. That does that will preserve the liberal and democratic value of equality as moral parity. Traditional societies have located the source of our moral equality in a set of necessary and sufficient intrinsic properties, such as our rationality, our autonomy, properties that may not be possessed when people are in conditions of inevitable dependency. Instead, in previous work, I've suggested a relational understanding of equality, in which we recognize each other as some mother's child. We are all, what do we have in common? We are all some mother's child. By that I mean, we're all someone in whom care has been invested, as none of us would survive, much less thrive, without such care. Whether we use this aphorism or some other formulation, the point is that our equality resides in the relational nature of self, of care and self-formation through another. rights and responsibilities. With a justice based on a deontological theory such as Kant's, rights can only be constrained by other rights. But in a theory based on a care ethic, responsibilities and rights with their correlate duties are mutually constraining. That is, rights do not always trump responsibilities, nor do responsibilities always trump rights. Consider, for example, a caregiver who finds herself needing to stay behind her scheduled time because of a medical appointment of a charge goes longer than expected. As a worker, she has a right to leave at her appointed time. However, her responsibilities trump her rights. Can't just leave the dependent person there alone. But she also has a right to demand that such overtime be well compensated. This right may trump responsibilities that an agency has to use its funds primarily for the benefits of its clients. So, in such a theory, we would be balancing rights and responsibilities. The domain governed in social life. This is the domain in which fair terms of social cooperation pertain in liberal theories of justice is the public domain of governance and economic exchange. They bypass the largely privatized domains in which care normally takes place. A concept of justice guided by an ethic of care would instead take the realm of care as central to justice and not as simply peripheral. Freedoms and the satisfaction of needs. We have to understand freedom differently here. Freedom as the freedom to enlarge in desired and desirable relationships, as well as the freedom to be left alone. Freedom is also understood here as truly possible only when important needs are satisfied. We are no freer if we are hungry because we're unable to feed ourselves when left to our own devices than if our hunger results from someone preventing us from eating. Therefore, legitimate needs issue not only in rights, but in the social responsibility to meet needs. Asymmetry of power and problem of domination. This is a biggie because within liberal theory, we think of each other as all equals, and in theory, equally situated and equally empowered. You can't do that when you're thinking about relationships of dependency. They are inherently asymmetrical. So, recognizing that the constituents of the political order go through periods of inevitable dependency, and that the dependency and care of dependence creates inextricable interdependencies, which also involve asymmetrical power relations. We need a theory of justice that recognizes that some power inequalities are inevitable and will establish means by which to prevent those from subjecting the vulnerable to domination, abuse, exploitation, and neglect. That will be the point. Such protections become a primary responsibility of a just social order. The last are allocation and distribution. This is a lot of political theories, particularly, I think particularly here of Rawls, talks about this is a theory of distribution, not of allocation. But if we're looking to fulfill needs as a primary project of our social institutions, then we are interested in allocation as well as distribution. We're looking at prioritizing resources to meet dependency needs. These become central, not peripheral, distributing the burdens of dependency. And the last is contract. And something happened to my contract, so you'll have to just listen. I'm sorry, something happened to my contract here too. No, no issues. Such a theory, and you touched on this, cannot be thought of as a contract between equally situated and equally empowered individuals. And that's because those whose interests most need protection are those least able to come to the table. Contract theory does important work in political theory. It provides a framework for what constitutes legitimate coercive state power. It gives equal dignity to each contracting party. So is there a political concept that can serve the same good purposes, even when we understand that the constituents are not equally empowered and not necessarily capable of autonomous action? And there's a notion that's closely related to contract here that I think is helpful, and that's the notion of a covenant. The term has many meanings, and sometimes it simply just means contract. But the way in which I want to understand it is it's an acknowledgement of a relationship or an agreement that already exists, wherein we accept responsibilities or submit to conditions entailed in being that relationship. For example, if you purchase land that is covered by a covenant, we are constrained by what we can do with that land, and we accept certain responsibilities. Now, it's our private land. We bought it. We should be able to do anything we want with it, right? As a privatized piece of property in a contract situation. But if you're dealing with a piece of land that's under a covenant, you don't get to do that because the land needs to be protected. The animals need to be protected. You need to be concerned about your neighbor's relationship to the land and so forth. And similarly, consider the duties a parent owes to a child. These are not a consequence of a contract between parent and child. The relationship of parent to a child is instead bound by a covenant that parenthood entails and which raises legitimate expectations on the part of society at large, as well as the child in particular. Now, the above paint the picture of a contrast that really is quite a contrast with theories of justice from traditional ethical theories. And the question is, if we're working with these kinds of concepts, what kinds of principles of justice might we want? I think I've gone on longer than I was supposed to going to, or because I want to, so I maybe will run through the principles quickly.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can take another 10 minutes.
Okay. So I want to say that there are three primary principles and one overarching principle. And the first principle is the principle of non-deprivation and non-discrimination. The second is a principle of non-exploitation, which has a part for dependency workers and for dependents. And it is also, it talks about opportunities for inclusion and participation in both, for both dependency workers and for dependents. The third principle is the support for sustaining caring bonds. The overarching principle is what I'll call an enhanced principle of dulia. So let me just quickly talk about each in turn. The first principle of non-deprivation and non-discrimination. That public resources and opportunities be distributed in such a way that meeting dependency needs receive prima facie priority over other concerns, and that opportunity not be denied because of dependency needs. Look, I'm talking utopia here. I'm not talking about what we can expect to happen here tomorrow, but I'm talking about trying to change the way in which we think of the responsibilities of our society. Right? So if we think about society in terms of questions of dependency and dependency needs, then we have to prioritize those needs. They're crucial to what social organization is all about. Second principle of non-exploitation and opportunities for inclusion and participation. For dependency workers, the labor of caring for dependents must never be coerced. In fact, today, much of that labor is effectively coerced. It's the people who can't get any other jobs who wind up taking care of dependents, for when we're talking about paid dependency workers. They must be fully and appropriately compensated. And we had a long talk in the seminar about how critical it is for the dependency workers to be properly respected and valued in order for us to get the kind of care we really need. And third, that doing dependency work, which a lot of people do for just a period of their time, must not then close off opportunities for those who then want to go on and do other things. And that's the principle for non-exploitation, because it's an exit option. It's an exit option and helps to eliminate some exploitative conditions. For dependents, the institutional protections to ensure that dependents are not left exposed to abuse or exploitation. And again, an inclusion and participation principle, recourse to the greatest amount of freedom of opportunity commensurate with their capabilities. And that's what the disability community has been working with some success toward. Support for sustaining effective and non-exploitive caring relations, caring bonds. Within a liberal theory that begins and ends, that begins with individuals, there is no place in that theory, we see it in our legal theory, there's very little place for protection of caring bonds. Good, effective and non-exploitive caring bonds. So a theory of justice of this sort would want to have a principle that would support and protect bonds formed through care, and assure protections and resources that enable caring bonds to be sustained without becoming exploitative or abusive. And that will work then in conjunction with a principle of non-exploitation. And finally, the overarching principle of dulia, which I've already talked about. We are obliged to give care to those who need it to the extent that we're able to and in a position to do so. And when we are in need of care, we are owed that care by someone who is well positioned to give it and who will be appropriately compensated and cared for when they need care. One of the scandals in the United States is those people who give care have no insurance, no medical care, are themselves left just dangling. And these are the people who provide care. The enhancement here comes from a notion that I've become convinced is a very important notion in the ethics of care. And that is that care, if we're to have some kind of normative, evaluative standard for what constitutes care, because you don't have simple recipes, because care has to cater to the particularity of the needs of a given individual. How do you know when you've cared? When the person has taken up your care as care. And one way to present that intuitive notion, make that notion more intuitive for you, is think about scenario. You've got someone walks by a plant. The plant is withering, needs water. They pick up a glass, lick it, pour it in. Turns out to be vinegar. Have they cared for the plant? Plant dies. Have they cared for the plant? No. You only know that they've cared for the plant when the plant picks up the caring, takes up that caring. Well, I think that's implicit in all of our understanding of care. And the reason I bring that into a political situation is that it creates an obligation on caring, on institutions that are supposed to be caring, not to determine that they've already given care when they decide they've given care, but they have to find out if that care is effective. If the people who they're giving that care to are actually taking on that care. And that is an important principle so that caring institutions don't become paternalistic and become fully responsive to those they're caring for. So, all in all, if we're talking about fair terms of social life, given our inevitable dependency and our inextricable interdependency, we're saying first that when one is in a condition of dependency, whether as a dependent or dependency worker, the dependency does not blight our prospects for a good life. And second, that the condition of dependency, when fairly dealt with, will leave no one, really no one, not just the rational, independent actors, but will leave no one less well off than anyone needs to be. One objection. Isn't it counterintuitive to say that we want a system of justice that makes sure that your condition of dependency doesn't blight your life? I mean, isn't it just a fact of nature that, if you have a disability, your life's going to be worse off, If you're going to be caring for a disabled person, too bad, your life's going to be worse off. Well, the disability movement gives us a lesson here. Because what disabled people have been able to say again and again and again, that their quality of life is as good as anyone else's quality of life. And if it isn't good, it's usually because they don't get things that they need from society, that people make fun of them, social things that can be changed. And so we should not assume, and similarly, people think, oh, you have a disabled child, your life must be worse. Well, there are certain things that are not so great. If people don't respect my child, I feel less respected. If my child isn't treated equally, I feel I'm not treated equally. But those are social conditions. Those are not inherent conditions. And my life isn't worse because I have a child with disability. It's enriched by disability, just like people with disability will talk about their life being enriched with disability. Our life is enriched by relations of dependency. Dependency relations are not simply a drag on our life, but they become a drag on our life when social conditions are not adequate to our meeting our responsibilities as dependency workers or our needs as dependents. So.